The avoidant has maintained distance following the relationship's end, has demonstrated through sustained silence that they have no intention of pursuing reconciliation, has given every indication that they have moved on and released whatever minimal investment they maintained during the relationship. You have completed the difficult work of accepting this reality, of releasing your hope for their return, of redirecting your life away from waiting for someone who demonstrated through consistent behavior that they could not meet your needs. You have achieved genuine emotional distance, where thinking about them generates neither longing nor bitterness, where you have built satisfying life that no longer includes space for their defended limitations. Then the avoidant reaches out, not with clear communication about wanting to reconcile, not with direct acknowledgement of what went wrong or how they have changed, but rather with seemingly casual contact that appears insignificant on its surface, yet serves crucial assessment function for the avoidant's defended psychology. This contact is not random impulse or genuine attempt at connection, but rather represents first of two calculated tests the avoidant administers before considering actual return. These tests operate largely outside the avoidant's conscious awareness. They are not deliberately manipulating you through strategic assessment, but rather are unconsciously measuring specific variables their defensive structure requires them to verify before they can risk vulnerable pursuit. The avoidant needs to determine whether you remain emotionally available to them, whether your boundaries have genuinely strengthened or merely represent temporary performance, whether you have actually transformed or simply strategically withdrawn, while maintaining the same patterns that allowed their defended position to continue throughout the relationship. The two tests the avoidant administers, the breadcrumb test, measuring your emotional availability, and the vulnerability test, measuring your boundaries, provide them with information their defensive structure needs to decide whether pursuing you feels safe or whether your transformation means they can no longer maintain the comfortable dynamic where they held power through your continued investment. Understanding these tests, recognizing them when they occur, and responding in ways that demonstrate genuine transformation rather than strategic positioning determines whether the avoidant returns and, more importantly, whether their return occurs under conditions where you maintain power or where you surrender power by revealing that nothing has actually changed beneath your performed distance. Test 1. The breadcrumb test, measuring your emotional availability. The avoidant initiates contact after extended period of silence with message that appears casual, inconsequential, designed to seem like innocent reaching out rather than strategic assessment. The message might reference something that reminded them of you, might ask simple question about topic you discussed during the relationship, might share piece of information they claim they thought you would find interesting. The content of the message carries less significance than its function. The avoidant is dropping breadcrumb to measure whether you remain hungry for their attention, to assess whether you will eagerly consume this minimal offering, to determine whether your emotional availability to them persists despite the time and distance that has passed since the relationship ended. This breadcrumb contact serves crucial assessment function for the avoidant's defensive structure. The avoidant needs to verify whether you remain invested before they risk more vulnerable pursuit, needs to confirm that the safety net of your continued availability still exists before they consider actually reaching out with genuine intention, needs to test whether you will respond with enthusiasm that signals they retain power to affect you, or with indifference that signals you have genuinely moved beyond their reach. The avoidant's defensive psychology cannot tolerate risk of vulnerable pursuit that might be rejected. So they send minimal, low-stakes contact that allows them to gauge your response without exposing themselves to the rejection that direct communication about reconciliation would risk. The breadcrumb test specifically measures your emotional availability through the quality and speed of your response. The avoidant observes whether you respond immediately, suggesting you were hoping to hear from them and remain readily accessible. They assess whether your response carries warmth and enthusiasm, indicating you interpret their minimal contact as positive development worth encouraging. They evaluate whether you extend the conversation beyond their initial message, demonstrating continued investment in maintaining connection with them. They notice whether you ask questions about their life, revealing you remain curious and emotionally engaged with their well-being. Each of these response characteristics provides information about whether you remain emotionally available in ways that would allow the avoidant to resume their defended position with you. The avoidant also uses the breadcrumb to test whether you will do the relational work of maintaining conversation from their minimal initiation. Throughout the relationship, you performed labor of keeping connection alive when the avoidant withdrew, of bridging distance the avoidant created, of maintaining engagement despite their minimal reciprocation. The breadcrumb tests whether this dynamic remains intact, whether you will take their small gesture and expand it into full conversation through your effort, whether you will interpret their minimal contact as invitation to restore connection you then work to build, whether you will once again assume responsibility for sustaining interaction. The avoidant initiates but does not maintain. The breadcrumb serves additional function of allowing the avoidant to restore some level of contact without committing to anything beyond the single message. If you respond enthusiastically, the avoidant gains confirmation that you remain accessible while retaining complete freedom to engage or withdraw based on their defended comfort. They can continue dropping occasional breadcrumbs to maintain your hope and investment without actually committing to sustained presence or to addressing the patterns that destroyed the relationship. The breadcrumb creates opening where the avoidant can have some connection on their defended terms. Minimal effort, maximum control, no obligation to provide consistency or emotional availability, while you provide the investment and hope that sustains that connection. The breadcrumb test also measures whether you will accept minimal offering as if it represents significant gesture. The avoidant observes whether you interpret their casual message as meaningful reconnection, whether you read importance into contact that carries no explicit intention beyond its surface content, whether you allow hope to be activated by gesture that requires minimal vulnerability or investment from them. Your willingness to treat breadcrumb as significant reveals that you remain in position where the avoidant's minimal efforts generate your maximum response, where their slight movements toward you produce your enthusiastic movement toward them, where the power dynamic that characterized the relationship remains intact. The avoidance breadcrumb also tests whether you will ignore the history of their patterns in your response to current minimal contact. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant demonstrated through consistent behavior that they could not provide adequate presence, that their occasional gestures toward connection did not translate into sustained availability, that brief moments of engagement did not represent genuine transformation of their defended position. The breadcrumb tests whether you have integrated this learning or whether you will respond to current contact as if it exists independent of this history, whether you will allow their single message to override your accumulated knowledge about their patterns, whether you will give them fresh start they have not earned through any demonstrated sustained change. Understanding the breadcrumb test requires recognizing that it operates as low-risk reconnaissance for the avoidant, rather than as genuine attempt at meaningful reconnection. The avoidant is not reaching out because they have transformed, not contacting you because they have done internal work to address their patterns, not initiating connection because they are prepared to show up differently. They are testing whether the conditions that allowed their defended position to continue throughout the relationship remain available, whether you still occupy psychological position where their minimal gestures generate your maximum investment, whether they can resume their patterns without facing the consequences that your genuine transformation would impose. The breadcrumb test provides the avoidant with information about whether returning to you would restore comfortable dynamic, where they held power, or whether your changes mean pursuing you would require vulnerability and sustained effort. Their defensive structure still resists what passing versus failing the breadcrumb test actually means. The conventional understanding suggests that responding enthusiastically to the avoidance breadcrumb, that engaging warmly with their minimal contact, that demonstrating continued investment represents successful response that increases likelihood of reconciliation. This interpretation assumes that showing the avoidant you still care, that making yourself available to them, that being receptive to their contact will encourage them to pursue further connection. Yet this conventional wisdom inverts the actual dynamics at play. In the avoidance defensive psychology, your enthusiastic response to their breadcrumb represents test failure that confirms nothing has changed, that you remain in the same position you occupied throughout the relationship, that they can resume their defended patterns without consequences. When you respond to the breadcrumb with enthusiasm, replying quickly with warm tone, extending the conversation through your questions and engagement, expressing pleasure at hearing from them, Interpreting their minimal contact as positive development, you fail the test by revealing that you remain emotionally available in ways that enable the avoidance patterns. Your enthusiastic response communicates that their minimal effort generates your maximum investment, that they retain power to affect you through slight gestures, that you will do the relational work of building connection from their minimal initiation. The avoidant receives confirmation that the dynamic that allowed their defended position throughout the relationship persists, that you have not genuinely transformed but have merely been waiting for their return, that they can pursue you knowing they can resume their patterns without facing genuine consequences. The enthusiastic response fails the test because it demonstrates that you have not integrated the learning the relationship should have provided. The avoidance patterns taught you that their occasional gestures toward connection do not translate into sustained presence, that their brief moments of engagement do not represent lasting change, that accepting their breadcrumbs leads to cycle where you maintain hope based on minimal offerings while they continue their defended unavailability. Your warm response to their current breadcrumb reveals you have not absorbed these lessons, that you remain willing to interpret their minimal contact optimistically, despite historical evidence that such optimism is unfounded, that you will give them access to you without requiring demonstrated sustained change in their patterns. Conversely, what appears to be test failure, responding with indifference or not responding at all, actually represents passing the breadcrumb test in ways that shift the entire dynamic. When you respond to the avoidance breadcrumb with brief neutral reply that carries no warmth or investment, when you acknowledge their message without extending conversation or expressing enthusiasm, when you treat their contact as unremarkable rather than as significant gesture, you pass the test by demonstrating that you are no longer emotionally available in ways that enable their patterns. Your indifferent response communicates that their minimal effort generates minimal response from you, that they no longer have power to affect you through slight gestures, that you will not do the work of building connection from their minimal initiation. Not responding at all to the breadcrumb represents even clearer passing of the test. Your silence communicates that you are genuinely unavailable, that their contact does not warrant response, that you have moved so far beyond them that their reaching out is irrelevant to your life and your well-being. The avoidant receives information that the dynamic has fundamentally shifted, that you have actually transformed rather than strategically withdrawn, that pursuing you would require genuine vulnerability and sustained effort, because you will not meet their minimal gestures with maximum investment that makes their defended position comfortable. Passing the breadcrumb test through indifference or silence creates crisis for the avoidance defensive structure because it eliminates the safety net they were testing for. The avoidant sent the breadcrumb partly to verify that you remain accessible before they risk more vulnerable pursuit. Your indifferent response or your silence reveals that you are not accessible in the ways you once were, that the comfortable dynamic where your investment compensated for their defended limitation no longer exists, that they cannot simply resume their patterns because you will not provide the enthusiastic reception that enables those patterns. This recognition forces the avoidant to confront that pursuing you would require showing up differently than they showed up throughout the relationship, that they cannot rely on your investment to maintain connection while they remain defended. The paradox emerges. Failing the breadcrumb test by responding enthusiastically makes reconciliation more likely in the short term, but guarantees that any restored relationship will replicate the same dysfunction that destroyed the original relationship. The avoidant returns knowing they can maintain their defended position because you revealed you have not actually transformed. Passing the breadcrumb test through indifference makes immediate reconciliation less likely, but creates the only conditions where eventual reconciliation might occur on healthy terms. The avoidant must recognize that pursuing you requires genuine transformation on their part because you will no longer accept their defended limitations. Understanding what passing versus failing the breadcrumb test means requires recognizing that the test is not about whether the avoidant returns, but rather about whether you have genuinely transformed. The avoidance breadcrumb provides you with opportunity to demonstrate through your response whether you have completed the internal work of releasing them and building life that no longer needs their presence. Enthusiastic response reveals you have not completed this work, that you remain invested in ways that enable their patterns. Indifferent response or silence reveals you have completed the work, that you genuinely no longer need them in ways that would allow their defended position to continue. The avoidant's eventual decision about whether to pursue you depends heavily on which message your response sends. Yet your response should reflect your actual internal state rather than strategic positioning designed to achieve desired outcome with them. Test 2, the vulnerability test, measuring your boundaries. The avoidant who receives indifferent response to their breadcrumb or who observes that their minimal contact generates no enthusiastic reception often escalates to second test that operates with greater psychological sophistication. This vulnerability test involves the avoidant displaying emotional openness they withheld throughout the relationship, sharing feelings they previously suppressed, demonstrating the very vulnerability you requested repeatedly during the relationship but they consistently refused to provide. The avoidant suddenly articulates that they miss you, that they recognize what they lost, that they have been thinking about you constantly. They express regret about their patterns, acknowledge how their behavior hurt you, admit they made mistakes they now wish they could correct. They share internal struggles they never revealed during the relationship, display emotional depth that contradicts the defended opacity that characterized their previous presentation. This vulnerability test serves to measure whether your boundaries have genuinely strengthened or whether they represent temporary performance that the avoidant's emotional openness can penetrate. The avoidant's defensive structure needs to determine whether you will soften when they finally offer what you wanted throughout the relationship, whether your stated commitment to protecting yourself will dissolve when confronted with the vulnerability you spent the relationship hoping they would demonstrate, whether you will abandon your boundaries when the avoidant displays exactly the emotional availability you claimed you needed. The vulnerability test specifically assesses whether your transformation is authentic or whether you were simply waiting for the avoidant to show up differently before resuming your previous patterns of accommodation and excessive investment. The avoidant displays vulnerability in ways calculated, though often unconsciously, to address the specific wounds the relationship created. They acknowledge the precise behaviors that hurt you most, express understanding of exactly what you needed that they failed to provide, demonstrate awareness of the patterns you communicated about repeatedly during the relationship. This targeted vulnerability suggests they have reflected deeply on the relationship, that they understand what went wrong, that they have achieved insight that could translate into behavioral change. The specificity and apparent genuineness of their vulnerability creates powerful pull to believe they have genuinely transformed, that the person you always knew existed beneath their defenses has finally emerged, that this time could be different if you gave them another chance. The vulnerability test also involves the avoidant sharing their fears and wounds in ways that generate your compassion and protectiveness. They reveal childhood experiences that explain their defensive patterns, articulate terror of intimacy that clarifies their withdrawal, express pain about their own limitations that humanizes them beyond their behavioral patterns. This sharing of wounds creates natural impulse to comfort them, to reassure them that you understand, to offer the empathy and care that characterized your response to their rare moments of vulnerability during the relationship. The avoidant is testing whether your boundaries can withstand your own compassionate impulses, whether you will prioritize protecting yourself over protecting them from discomfort their patterns created. The vulnerability test specifically measures whether you will interpret their emotional openness as evidence of change sufficient to warrant renewed relationship, rather than recognizing that vulnerability alone does not constitute transformation. The avoidant displays feelings and shares internal experience, yet feelings and internal experience are not behavior. The avoidant is not demonstrating through sustained behavioral change that they have developed capacity to show up differently. They are simply revealing that they have feelings and awareness they previously suppressed. The test measures whether you can distinguish between the avoidant having feelings about their patterns and the avoidant actually modifying those patterns through sustained different behavior across time. The vulnerability the avoidant displays often includes promises about their willingness to change, commitments to do the work necessary to develop greater intimacy capacity, assurances that they recognize what needs to be different. These promises accompany the vulnerability, suggesting that the avoidant's emotional openness reflects genuine readiness to transform rather than temporary performance designed to restore your investment. The vulnerability test measures whether you will accept these promises as sufficient evidence of change, or whether you will maintain boundaries that require demonstrated sustained behavioral transformation before considering reconciliation. The avoidance vulnerability also tests whether you will resume the role of being their emotional support while they work on themselves, without requiring that this work translates into them being able to meet your needs. The avoidant may request that you remain in their life as friend, or in some modified connection while they address their patterns, suggesting that your presence would help them feel safe enough to do the work. This request positions you as essential to their growth, while requiring nothing from them in terms of meeting your needs. The vulnerability test measures whether you will accept this framing where you provide support while receiving nothing, where your needs remain secondary to their process, where you invest in their potential transformation without guarantee that transformation will occur or will benefit you. Understanding the vulnerability test requires recognizing that the avoidance display of emotional openness serves assessment function rather than necessarily representing genuine transformation. The avoidant needs to determine whether vulnerability is sufficient to penetrate your boundaries, whether showing feelings can restore your investment without them having to demonstrate sustained behavioral change, whether you will soften your position when they finally offer the emotional availability you requested throughout the relationship. The vulnerability test provides the avoidant with information about whether they can restore the relationship through performance of vulnerability, or whether you require actual demonstrated transformation before considering renewed connection. What passing versus failing the vulnerability test reveals. The vulnerability test represents more psychologically sophisticated assessment than the breadcrumb test, because it deploys exactly what you wanted throughout the relationship, the avoidant's emotional openness and acknowledgement of their patterns, as tool to measure whether you have genuinely transformed or whether you remain in position where their demonstrations of vulnerability can override your self-protective boundaries. The conventional wisdom suggests that softening when the avoidant displays vulnerability, that responding with warmth to their emotional openness, that giving them another chance when they acknowledge their patterns represents compassionate response that honors their courage in being vulnerable. Yet this interpretation misses that the avoidance defensive structure is testing whether vulnerability alone can restore the dynamic where you invest, while they remain defended beneath surface-level emotional sharing. When you respond to the avoidance vulnerability by softening your boundaries, engaging warmly with their emotional sharing, expressing that you appreciate their openness, indicating willingness to consider reconciliation based on their vulnerable communication, you fail the test by revealing that your boundaries were performance rather than genuine transformation. Your softening demonstrates that you will abandon your commitment to protecting yourself when the avoidant offers what you wanted during the relationship, that you conflate vulnerability with change, that you will accept emotional openness as sufficient evidence of transformation without requiring sustained behavioral demonstration. The avoidant receives confirmation that they can restore your investment through display of feelings without actually having to modify their defended patterns through sustained different behavior. Failing the vulnerability test by softening reveals that you have not integrated crucial distinction between the avoidant having feelings about their patterns and the avoidant actually changing their patterns. The avoidant can acknowledge their behavior was harmful while continuing that behavior. They can express regret about their patterns while maintaining those patterns. They can display vulnerability about their limitations while those limitations continue to prevent adequate partnership. Your softening in response to their vulnerability demonstrates you have not learned that words and feelings, no matter how genuine they appear, do not constitute transformation without sustained behavioral change that demonstrates actual development of new capacities. The softening also reveals that your boundaries were contingent on the avoidance behavior rather than being rooted in genuine self-respect and self-protection. Throughout the relationship, you accommodated the avoidance patterns while hoping they would change. Your post-relationship boundaries represented recognition that they could not meet your needs and commitment to protect yourself from further harm. When you soften those boundaries in response to the avoidance vulnerability, you reveal that the boundaries were not genuine self-protection, but were rather tactical positioning designed to make the avoidant want you more. The avoidant recognizes that your boundaries dissolve when they offer minimal vulnerability, confirming that pursuing you does not require genuine transformation, but only requires surface-level emotional sharing. Conversely, passing the vulnerability test involves maintaining your boundaries despite the avoidant's emotional openness, receiving their vulnerability with compassionate neutrality that neither punishes their sharing nor interprets it as sufficient evidence of change. When you respond to the avoidant's vulnerability by acknowledging their feelings without softening your position, by expressing that you appreciate their openness while maintaining that reconciliation, would require sustained demonstrated behavioral change rather than vulnerable communication. By holding firm to your boundaries despite the pull to comfort and reconnect, you pass the test by demonstrating that your transformation is genuine rather than strategic. Passing the vulnerability test communicates several crucial messages to the avoidant's defensive structure. First, you demonstrate that you have integrated the learning that feelings and vulnerability do not constitute transformation, that you require sustained behavioral evidence of change rather than emotional communication about intention to change. Second, you reveal that your boundaries are rooted in genuine self-respect rather than in tactical positioning, that you will maintain those boundaries even when maintaining them feels difficult because they protect your well-being rather than serving to manipulate the avoidance response. Third, you show that you can hold compassion for the avoidant struggles while simultaneously protecting yourself from patterns that harm you, that your care for them does not require sacrificing your own needs or accepting their defended limitations. Passing the vulnerability test forces crisis for the avoidant because it eliminates their usual pathway back into your life. Throughout the relationship and in many of the avoidant's previous connections, displaying vulnerability eventually softened others' boundaries and allowed the avoidant to restore connection without genuinely transforming. Your maintenance of boundaries, despite their vulnerability, communicates that this pathway no longer functions with you, that they cannot rely on emotional openness alone to restore your investment, that pursuing you would require actual sustained behavioral change rather than performance of vulnerability, that buys time while their patterns continue unchanged. The maintained boundaries after the vulnerability test also force the avoidant to confront whether they possess genuine willingness to transform or whether their vulnerability was strategic display designed to restore connection on their defended terms. If the avoidant genuinely wants to develop greater capacity for intimacy, your boundary maintenance provides clear message about what would be required. Sustained behavioral change demonstrated across time rather than promises or vulnerable communication. If the avoidance vulnerability was primarily strategic, your boundary maintenance reveals that the strategy failed, that they cannot manipulate their way back into your life through emotional sharing, that you have genuinely moved beyond position where their feelings about you override your knowledge about their patterns. Understanding what passing versus failing the vulnerability test reveals requires recognizing that the test measures your actual transformation rather than measuring the avoidance transformation. The avoidance display of vulnerability provides you with opportunity to demonstrate whether you have completed internal work of building genuine self-respect and boundaries that protect your well-being regardless of what the avoidant offers. Softening reveals you have not completed this work, that you remain vulnerable to the avoidance demonstrations of feeling overriding your self-protection. Maintaining boundaries reveals you have completed the work, that you possess genuine self-respect that cannot be penetrated by vulnerability alone without sustained behavioral evidence of transformation. The avoidance response to your boundary maintenance determines whether they pursue genuine transformation or whether they recognize that you have moved beyond their reach and they must release you.